of conversations with authors of recent books. We hope that this format is engaging, and we'd welcome your feedback and love your feedback, because we hope to continue it throughout the fall, as all of our lectures for the fall semester will continue in the same format. I'd love to introduce our amazing Associate Director, Shana Marshall, who's going to introduce our wonderful speakers for today. So thanks so much for coming, and hope you enjoy the event.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining us, especially I know there's lots of time zones here in the list, so thanks everyone for, if it's early or if it's late, for joining us today. We'll be talking about Laleh Khalili's new book, relatively new book within the last year, Sinews of War and Trade. Laleh Khalili is a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London. In addition to her new book, Sinews of War and Trade, she is the author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, Time in the Shadows, Confinement and Counterinsurgency, and co-editor of Policing and Prisons in the Middle East, Formations of Coercion. Her research interests include transnational movements, infrastructure, and political violence. And we have as our discussant today, Pascal Menoret. Thank you again, Pascal, for joining us. He's a professor of anthropology and modern Middle East studies at Brandeis University. He's the author of Graveyard of Clerics, Everyday Activism in Saudi Arabia, Joyriding in Riyadh, Oil, Urbanism, and Road Revolt, and The Saudi Enigma, A History. He conducted 4 years of fieldwork in Saudi Arabia for those texts and has lived in France, Yemen, Egypt, and the UAE. So we'll go ahead and get started. Laleh, if you want to give just a super brief, comment about the book, then we'll just jump into the discussion between Laleh and Pascal. That'll go for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to general questions from the audience. If you would like, you can enter your question in the chat box, and I will record it. If you would like to raise your hand, we'll do that at the end if we have enough time, and see if folks want to ask their questions directly. But for now, please enter them in the chat box and we'll do it that way. Thanks very much. Okay, the floor is yours, Laleh.
Thank you. Muna and Shana, thank you so much for having me. This is extremely exciting. And I have to say, it's extremely exciting because I get to talk to my brilliant friend, Pascal. Really, of the choice of possible people to speak to, you're a superstar and former drinking buddy and all of that stuff. So it's great to be able to have a chat with you. Maybe I shouldn't have said that in public. It's also really lovely to see the faces and names of friends, former students among the attendees. So thank you very much also for being here. I'm going to speak very briefly about the book, just a couple of sentences really. And then, because I think it'd be much more interesting to talk to Pascal, especially because we haven't arranged beforehand, so the questions are not going to be, and the answers are not going to be rehearsed. The book came about when I decided that I really wanted to actually write about the back end of violence. So not the bloody front end, not where the bleeding edge of political violence and war and foreign intervention is, but actually the sort of more banal, quiet, military logistics side, the money side, the movement side, the material side. But of course, it became very clear that it wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have been able to talk about war and violence and the logistics of war and violence without talking about the violence of trade and of capitalism. And so, in a way, the project that started much more in the stream of my usual writing, which is mostly concerned with the question of political violence, has become something about a bit more, a lot more about political economy. It was also a really interesting project for me because I had worked primarily on the Mashraq with Palestinians in particular, and both in Lebanon and in Palestine itself. And so a shift to the Arabian Peninsula was quite an interesting experience for me. It was actually a really fantastic experience because it also upturned a lot of the received wisdom and cliches about the area. It was an extraordinary research project. I highly recommend working on modern maritime, modern infrastructure in the Middle East. It is a field that more and more people are becoming interested in, but it is also, there's a lot of puzzles to be resolved, a lot of questions to be answered. And it's a field that is really exciting. And so part of the reason that the book has been, I'm not done with it yet. There's a lot of research still coming out of it. I have not spent my interests in it. Is precisely because of this, because I feel in particular, and Pascal and I'll talk about this, I'm sure, because it'll come up inevitably. A lot of the focus on the Arabian Peninsula often has been solely on a kind of a rentier oil economy and or security, and so much else that is fascinating or exciting or interesting about that part of the world is only now emerging out of the body of scholarship. I mean, of course, there's always been a few really amazing pieces of work, Pascal actually being one of them. But by and large, one of the most exciting things about this has been to actually be a bit of an interloper in a new area and discover that there's so much more to be learned. So with that, I'm actually going to ask Pascal to start interrogating me.
All right, thank you, Laleh. Thank you, Shayna and Mona, for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here and to see Laleh on a small screen. It would be much better to see you in person, but I hope we will do that soon. So I love the book. I mean, it's I've basically read parts of it twice for not only because I've loved the book, but also because I was so excited to when it came out that I couldn't wait for the paper version. So I got a Kindle version, and then when I got the paper version, I reread it basically, and so it's a fantastic book. And I'm going to basically go through a few of the questions I have. I have roughly 3.5 questions that are really serious and 3.5 questions that are really less serious. So let's start with the serious stuff. And basically, the book is about shipping, right? It's about shipping infrastructure. It's about shipping logistics. It's about that hidden side of wars and of military activities. And basically, it shows that over the past 50 to 60 years, shipping has been taking pipelines as a model for efficient activity, for frictionless or quasi-frictionless transportation with, you transport stuff in even less time, with even less labor, with even less choke points, with even less, legal strings attached, and so on and so forth. I mean, we could tell all the wonderful stuff you tell in the book, right? I mean, 3 men to unload or load a super tanker as opposed to dozens of workers, for instance. And so somewhere in the book, you call this the fantasy of the Hyperloop. And pipelines are kinds of Hyperloops, right? In closed environments, little friction, fully sealed tube, and basically stuff going through it. And basically, looking back at some of the stories you tell in the book, how does this fantasy have very, very real effects, right? It's a fantasy with very real, very dire effects on the way the world is organized and on the way not only shipping is organized, but also war is conducted. So, and also the way, we understand states and corporations. So can you walk us through some of those stories?
Yeah. So the Hyperloop, I love the fact that you picked up on the Hyperloop. So the Hyperloop, just in case there are others who don't know what it is a fantasy, or specifically of Richard Branson's, actually, the guy from Virgin, the villain, I should say, from Virgin Airlines. And what the Hyperloop is supposed to be literally a frictionless train that operates in sort of the back end or the land side of ports and transports the stuff that comes down from the ship, and it transports that cargo through the port and then perhaps from the port into the cities and perhaps even in an intercity way. And part of the reason that it's a fantasy is because it imagines that all forms of physical, mechanical friction are going to be resolved in it. And that means that it's going to be essentially working, this train is going to be a kind of a bullet train in a pressurized tube that is sealed, air sealed, and therefore there's no dust or anything else. And so this is going to be, the ultimate kind of fast mode of transport. So why is this a fantasy? there's something that I immediately want to bring up. One of the things that I was really interested in when I first read about the Hyperloop was that it reminded me of the story that Gökçe Gönel tells in her fantastic book, The Spaceship in the Desert, about the little automated trains that travel in Masdar City in UAE. And these little automated trains are supposed to be completely and totally without any people. So nobody's operating them. They're supposed to go from point A to point B, and they're supposed to actually have reduced the amount of human involvement in them. And yet one of the stories that Gökçe tells is that because of the location of the trains and because of the ways in which the environment actually ends up becoming a reality with which we all have to contend, every morning a migrant worker, a racialized, underpaid migrant worker, has to take an old school broom and sweep off the rails so that the supposedly frictionless fast train that goes in Masdar City and hyper electronic, really wonderful, and get the dust off of it. And so the sort of the fantasy of a kind of an efficient, environmentally progressive place in Masdar City ends up fitting very well with the old ways of doing things. So for me, what the Hyperloop and also blockchain, who, if anybody here follows business journals, you'll hear about that as well, are part of the fantasy of capitalism. It's a kind of a unwarranted optimism, which goes along with the elasticity of capital, with its ability to recuperate through even the biggest crisis. Often, actually, that recuperation happens through extraordinary cost to everybody. So, to give you an example, this kind of eternal optimism means that you're building bigger all the time. When you build a port that is bigger all the time, you have to dredge the harbors, particularly in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf. Now, in some of the other coasts of the Arabian Peninsula, the problem is not shallow waters. The problem, for example, in the Red Sea, is that the seabed is heavy coral stones, and it's actually an extremely rare and extremely endangered ecosystem underneath of this kind of a coral bed in which hot water species, very few places have that kind of a temperature in them actually subsist, especially because the Red Sea is quite deep. And so what you have to do in order to build ever deeper harbors in these places, you'd have to actually violate the seabed in ways that inevitably destroy the very fragile environmental balance in those. In order to have people to build these places, you import workers that are going to be working in a 40, 50 degree temperature with very little ability to actually address the ways in which they're exploited at work, or even address the fact that they're forced to work often, again, as I said, at 45, 50 degree temperatures at the height of the noon to build these infrastructures. And so this fantasy of ever-growing economies results in actually a fundamental violence every day, slow violence against both the workers and sometimes not so slow violence, and against the environment, in particular those coastal areas which are extraordinary. I mean, this is also another thing that was interesting for me, was that of course when people think about the Arabian Peninsula, the standard image is of deserts, is of sand dunes, and the standard narrative that goes with the sand dunes is a kind of a arid, a kind of an infertile and in kind of an inhospitable environment. But of course, what we have learned, in particular in the last 30, 40 years, is that in fact, that fantasy of these inhospitable, infertile environments, for example, the salt flats that sit at the border between the sea and the shore in a lot of the Gulf Coast, or the coral, hard stone coral that forms some of the seashore on the Red Sea, or the very gray and red looking scrubby areas along the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean, are in fact incredibly rich ecosystems. And yet this kind of a fantasy of constant growth, a kind of an unwarranted optimism of capitalism, which comes through these massive mega infrastructural projects, often violates those in extremely damaging and sometimes unrecuperable ways. So that the Hyperloop takes you there. The Hyperloop is one of the elements of this huge sort of juggernaut, which goes along with the idea that there's not going to be any friction. But of course, reality is that we live in a world of frictions, as Annette Sting has taught us again and again.
Yeah, so this actually leads me to a question about politics, right? And about protest politics in particular, because what you show in in your wonderful description of port making is that ports have been suburbanized, right? They've moved to the suburbs, they've moved outside of the cities, outside of the historical ports, at a distance from basically the world of politics and the world of nation states, right? And toward a world that is almost offshore, and is the world of corporations. And so basically how do workers mobilize and organize in that world of, that brave new world of semi-automated ports and of quasi-frictionless, even though there are a lot of frictions, but in that kind of environment, what do protest politics look like in the ports of the Arabian Peninsula today?
So I'm going to actually start outside of the Arabian Peninsula with your hometown. The absolutely most spot-on experience of ports being shifted out from the center of town gradually over the course of actually almost 2 centuries is the port of Marseille in France, where if anybody has ever visited, you know that there is a kind of a touristy area, there's a fish market early in the morning, and that used to be actually the major sailing port for the port of Marseille. But as Marseille became more and more commercial, and of course as France expanded its empire, it needed a slightly larger port, so not in the harbor, not in the Vieux-Port itself, but a little bit further to the west, which now is too small and has become a kind of a cruise ship port. And the port of Marseille has now shifted about 40 miles, I think, further west to Fos-sur-Mer. So a town entirely unrelated to Marseille, but that's the port of Marseille. Much the same way that Jabal Ali, which is 50 miles southwest of Dubai itself, has become the port of Dubai. Now, what is interesting, and of course Dubai has exactly that same kind of movement as well. So you've got the Dow ports, which used to be in the center of the creek. So as you came down in the creek, that was where the Dow ports were, and they still continue to be. And in fact, that's one of the interesting differences, that this is still very much a functioning cargo port, and it's not a kind of a museumized Dow port. And that's what's fascinating about it, is that this is not a residual category of trade. It's continuing, it's vibrant, and it provides essentially a feeder to the larger port at Jabal Ali. And that's actually really important to recognize. And wonderful scholars like Jatin Dua and others have insisted that we shouldn't think of these Dow ports as a kind of a museum or a kind of residual category, but rather they are very modern, they're very interwoven with the big mechanized port at Jabal Ali. So the next step after that, of course, was the Sheikh Rashid port, which is now in sort of at the mouth of the creek. And then after that, very quickly after that, Jabal Ali was opened, so as I said, 40, 50 miles further south. And what is fascinating about that is when the Dow ports were in the center of town, the sailors that worked those, sailors and dockers that worked those ports actually had access to the people around them. So there was a possibility of mobilizing kin groups, but also, very importantly, sympathetic groups to come in and join you in your strikes, for example. But the further out you move, and the more securitized and more mechanized the port becomes, the more difficult it becomes to actually mobilize, because a degree of surveillance within the port space itself, which is now no longer sitting in the middle of a bustling city, but in a very securitized and barbed wire area for which you actually need multiple sort of security permissions to be able to enter the port itself. And so it's going to be a lot harder for the workers to call on the King Group or the city residents or whatnot. And the best examples of that are the port of Bahrain, but also in Aden. Aden, which is also in my project because it was absolutely crucial for me to include Aden, which was once the fourth most important fueling port in the world after New York, London, and Liverpool, also has one of the most amazing histories of labor mobilization of any place in the Middle East, actually. And what was fascinating about it was that the workers of the port could bring the city to standstill, and they could do so because they had massive support from others. So if the dockers went on strike, the street sweepers would also go on strike in their support. And the bazaar would shut down, the souk would shut down, and they would bring food to the strikers and try to support them for as long as they needed to. And so there is this element of the port being in the city that allowed for the dockers to call on, as I said, the people around them. And that has definitely been wiped out to a large extent. And we see that actually not just in the Gulf, but also in all the super mechanized, hyper mechanized ports in the world, where you see, for example, the ghost port of Rotterdam, where there are entire terminals where you barely see anybody. Of course, there are humans there. So again, this is a fantasy also of complete and total absence of humans because of automation, but there are always going to be people there. They're going to be cleaners. They're going to be sweepers, actually. They're going to be the people who are sitting in the computer control rooms, now very hyper-skilled workers who operate the cranes. And so you're going to have all of these different people that are there, but the bustling shape of the former docks, where the workers on the docks and the seafarers could call upon those in the city, that is really, with these hyper-mechanized ports, it's really something of the past.
Yeah, what's fascinating is when you look closely at the story of these new ports, even those that are the most far away from urban environments and from these dense population centers, have their histories of strikes, of popular mobilization, of collective mobilization, of protests. From Yemen. I think of some of the oil ports of Yemen, which are really in the middle of nowhere, but you have a very dense history of organizing in these, all the way up to the UAE coast, and in Dubai, of course, in Abu Dhabi as well. Despite the heavy top-down nature of security and safety and all the efforts to crack down on protests, there is stuff happening.
What's exciting about that is that I actually, when I started going through researching both memoirs of political activists and also archival labor attaché reports in both the American and British, the USian and British archives, is that up until about 1970s, you actually had really radical movements arising out of places like Qatar and Abu Dhabi, like the Das Island and Abu Dhabi. Again, these were hyper-mechanized super ports. And one of the interesting things, and I think this is something to actually really point out to, is that the ways in which these particular forms of protest were contained, they still happen, mobilization still happens, but the way that they were contained was by extraordinary state violence. And the state violence was often sponsored and encouraged by whichever colonial master was the closest by, whether it was the British or the USians. And so I think that that's also really important to recognize, is that it wasn't that somehow this died down because we've come in an era of neoliberalism or some such. This wasn't a mechanical process by which the protests died down or people became affluent. It was a very specific set of policies involved. There's a letter from a British Labour attaché in which they say, we cannot have, these workers were all Arab workers, some native to Qatar or Abu Dhabi, but many from other places, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, etc. And the Labour attaché specifically writes this. He says they all speak to one another in Arabic, and they all have the support of their governments. This is in the 1960s, the height of Pan-Arabism. And so what we need to have is workers that don't speak the language of the natives, and what we need to have are governments that are not necessarily going to step in. And so there was a very specific political decision made to change the profile of labor in that area. And I think that this is something really important to point out, was that, again, this wasn't something that just happened through a kind of a natural development. There were very specific policies that were enacted for this.
You brought up Marseille, and it's kind of funny. I mean, I was fortunate enough to hang out with you when you came to Marseille to research CMA CGM, and basically I have a very Marseillais question about the relationship between the hinterland and the coast, right? I mean, the hinterland always thinks of itself as being above and beyond the coast, and basically directing the coast, that the coast is inferior. I think not only of France, but also of Saudi Arabia, for instance, right?
Yeah.
And the relationship between Riyadh and the coasts, or even Yemen, with the relationship between Sana'a and its two coasts. So basically, the story you write is putting that hinterland superiority on its head, right? It shows that things come from the horizon, right? And that basically what happens above the seas is actually more important than what nation states are doing. And you show that there is a regime of arbitration, of international arbitration, that basically displaces those newly created, newly independent states, and resembles, what we could look at as a super capitulation regime, right? To take the capitulation regime of the Ottoman Empire as an example, and basically you also show very brilliantly. I mean, the book is that legal chapter is probably my favorite, because it's so mind blowing. It basically displaces so many of the categories we have to think about these things. It shows how the notion of freedom of the seas is basically the very opposite of what it is, right? I mean, it's a very young Marx chapter, in the fact that it basically puts everything on its head. So could you guide us through some of the legal adventures that you've retraced in the book, and how they change our thinking about corporations and states?
So one quick thing about the hinterland. I thought you were going to ask me about roads, which of course I got into because of reading your book, Joyriding in Riyadh. And there's actually an entire chapter about roads in there. But I do also have to say that I think that the relationship between the hinterland and the coast are really symbiotic. Lindsay Stevenson, who writes about ports and hinterlands in Iran, actually, and the Gulf, would absolutely have my head if she thought that I was privileging the coast over the hinterland. And I do think that relationship is symbiotic. One wouldn't survive with another, especially for places such as this, where there's an entire economy that also exists not right on the coast. But going to the legal stuff, so there's something quite strangely pleasing about trying to decipher legal jargon. And there were several categories of legal jargon which I felt that could be addressed. So one, of course, is the entire language that emerges out of transformation of geographic or geophysical features into legal categories. So one example would be the Continental Shelf. The Continental Shelf, in the language of geographers, is essentially where the land portion drops off under the sea. It has to do with tectonic plates. It has to do with the way that the different parts of geological land actually has stacked up on each other and its relationship to the sea. But it has been transformed actually over oil, and actually by the United States, into a legal category. So what do I mean by that is that it has become part of a kind of a corpus of law which decides who can take advantage of the resources that exist in the continental shelf. And the first time that such a case emerged was actually between the state of California and the federal government of the US, where the state of California wanted to have control over its own continental shelf, and this federal government went all the way to the Supreme Court, and there were edicts and all sorts of things by Truman, essentially said, no way, that we are the ones who license that land. And the moment that those kinds of edicts were issued in the US, a whole series of sort of government edicts were issued throughout the world, and in the Gulf, where the British, the Saudis were the first, and then where the British were actually had their protectorates one after another issued the boundaries of their own continental shelf. So there's one legal category which was about how governments transform a geophysical feature into a legal category which they can then use. And then there were all sorts of lawsuits and whatnot between corporations and the ruling families, often in these places, over who got to exploit that, what the division was of the extraction of funds on that. There were a second legal category which I was really interested in, and that was arbitrations. And in fact, the more I have studied international dispute resolution, the more of a sordid area it has become. And it's fascinating to see how little actually critical writing there is about commercial arbitration. There's lots of really fascinating stuff, but very little in comparison with, for example, how much stuff there is on constitutional law or whatnot. And this is actually an enormously important category, and it is one that obviously there's always been international forms of arbitration, but it has become profoundly important as a kind of a dispute resolution mechanism between corporations and states. And it has become important exactly at the moment in which post-colonial states were becoming independent from their former colonies and were often laying claim to their natural resources, and often through nationalizing language. And so the moment that they began these processes of nationalization, you ended up having the invention of these dispute mechanisms between the corporations that were saying, no, you cannot nationalize, we own your resources. And the newly independent states that were saying, well, no, these resources were given to you, often the concession to them were given to you during the colonial era, and you're not paying us enough, and so we're going to nationalize them. And these disputes would go to international arbitration, and I would say 99% of them are ruled on behalf of the corporations. So this has continued, and one of the most litigious corporations that engages in this sort of international disputes, dispute arbitration, is Dubai Ports World, which is the world's fourth largest port management company. And the way that they use this arbitration process is against smaller, less powerful states. So they've taken Djibouti to international arbitration 3 or 4 times. They're currently, if you just look up the World Bank's international arbitration or dispute resolution, whatever it's called, the forum, you'll find that they're probably in dispute with some port in Latin America, another one in Europe, etc., etc. They have, despite the fact that many of you guys may remember that in 2006, Dubai Ports World bought a port management company that owned 6 ports in the US, and of course they were absolutely denied the ability to take over those. There was a whole lot of anti-Arab, racist language that was used. There was a lot of the labor dockers groups were upset about this. They sort of went in all sorts of Islamophobic and Arabophobic language, and so Dubai Ports World had to give up its concessions in the US that it had in 2006. And it never took the US to arbitration court. So it becomes very clear that these arbitral mechanisms tend to be very, very, they're essentially neocolonial forms of extension of power that almost always end up to the benefit of those corporations, even if those corporations are now in post-colonial states.
So I think we only have a few minutes left for our side of the conversation, or what?
Yeah, actually we can go till 12:40 because I haven't actually gotten an audience question yet, so you can continue.
Okay, good.
So thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking of those two legal objects. I was also thinking of what you write about free zones.
Oh, yes.
there is a line that you write that I really love. It's dictators love free zones, right? And so basically it nails it, right? It shows how authoritarian regimes, despite the fact that they invoke al-amn al-qawmi or al-amn al-watani, national security, are actually very national insecure, or they love national insecurity. They don't
Yes.
like the nation state as much as they claim they do, and I find that part of that chapter totally fascinating. I mean, I was thinking of that page when I was thinking, there is a young Marx quality to this chapter, because it takes your assumptions about national security, boom, flipped. Actually, dictators love national insecurity. They don't love national security. I have a question about the book as a book, and it's more about writing strategies. And I love the way the book is organized, and how you tell stories. Could you tell us more about how you went about creating that tapestry of stories, right? That is very it's multi-layered. I mean, that's why I use tapestry, because at first reading you read story after story after story, and then when you go back and you read it again, you realize that there was so many things and so many details you were missing. So there are so many layers of signification, yet it's a page turner. So how did you achieve that, right? That balance?
So when I decided to go with Verso, and I specifically wanted to go with a non-academic publisher, with an intellectual academic publisher, I asked my very phlegmatic editor, give me a model of writing that I should emulate. And he said, Mike Davis's City of Quartz. And so I've read Mike Davis's City of Quartz several times, and I went and read it. And when it became clear, and I actually quote a little passage of it in there in the introduction, is that Mike Davis likes to tell stories. And he doesn't sort of bang you over the head with theory, or with even he doesn't even bang you over the head with a broader argument that he sort of imposes right from the start, so that he frames it for you. He forces you to go and read through. And now, actually, the newer version, the newer edition of City of Quartz does have a new preface by him in which he has a one-sentence argument. But really, the book itself makes you want to read, because it wants to tell you stories. And so that's what I decided that I wanted to do. I started writing, and the original manuscript, so this one is almost exactly 100,000 words with all of the bits. The original manuscript was 150,000 words, and I had to cut it down by 50,000 words. So there's a lot came out of it. And so what it came down to was what mattered to me, and if I excluded something, would that impede the understanding of how today's maritime transport, trade, and war making and logistics operates? And so everything that I've included in there is, to me, a crucial element of what maritime transport is today. So I begin by talking about sea routes. I go on then to talk about harbor making, so the actual construction of harbors. I talk about the roads and rails that lead out of the harbors, because without being able to transport the cargo away, obviously these harbors are not doing their work. I talked about the law, and of course the manufactured absence of the law in free zones. And then I talked about the people that were involved in this. So I have two chapters about the workers, the seafarers and the landside workers. And then I have a chapter about the experts, the charlatans, the advisors, the kings, the colonials. And finally, I had to throw in that original impetus for the book, which is about war. And it took a lot of sort of rearranging of everything in order for me to be able to tell the story in ways that fit together. But in a way, what I have included is all of the stuff that I gathered, which I thought were amazing. And I have to say that a lot of that was also inspired in part by reading enormous amounts of fiction and poetry around ports and the sea, you'll recognize some of my epigraphs as books that you introduced me to, for example, and or ones that I found in your house. And books of poetry, particularly, there's an enormous body of amazing poetry that comes out of the Caribbean about the sea and working on the sea, and sort of of course the sort of harrowing history of slavery and enslavement on the sea. And so for me, it was also really interesting to have this kind of a comparative sense of poetic echoing. And I include also, perhaps the source that I cite the most, other than the archives, is Abdurrahman Munif. Because his Cities of Salt, which I have read about 5 times now as I wrote this book, constantly yielded insights. And what I mean is, I'm sorry, but I should have become a novelist. I don't have the talent, but I should have become a novelist, because the insights that are yielded by Abdurrahman Munif's extraordinary novel, I don't know, it's just, it's humbling. And so as I said, I constantly mine his passages for shedding light on some of the things that I thought were quite vexing.
So that's a perfect segue for maybe the last question. What's your current project? What's your next book?
So I'm actually writing several articles. Some of these have been bits that I've pulled out of the book, which I now want to do a bit more research on and write. So more academic articles rather than kind of storytelling. And one of them is about the mission to seafarers, which in the absence of unions is the only body that actually can provide some support to abandoned seafarers. And it's a missionary organization, and I want to write about them. So recently their archives, they have offices, they have sort of supporting offices on a bunch of ports in the Gulf, surprisingly, and their archives have just become available here in the UK. And so I've done a bunch of research there, and I want to write something about that. I want to write an article about the melancholy that seafarers feel at sea, and I think that that's going to be a much more, maybe I'll try my hand at something slightly more elegiac, less academic. But one of the things that is really striking is the loneliness and melancholy that seafarers feel, and I really want to write about that. And then I have some really, really standard sounding articles about tankers, because the more I read about them, the more the weird chemical engineer in me was like, ooh, technical stuff, I really want to understand this. So I'm going to write about tankers a little bit. And then I've got a book that I want to write about US Navy SEALs, which in a way, US Navy SEALs, they're amphibian forces, they work in the water, but it also goes back to my counterinsurgency stuff. So I've got a few plans for the next 4 or 5 years. So, but we'll see what happens after that. One possibility that keeps sort of appealing to me, and I really want to do it, but I'm not sure I'm going to get around to, is to go back to Beirut, where I started my research life, and write about the port there, because the connections of Beirut and Palestinians to the Arabian Peninsula is constantly highlighted throughout my book. But also CMA-CGM, which you mentioned, which is the world's 3rd largest shipping company based out of Marseille, is actually founded by a Syrian Beiruti family. And so there are all sorts of shipping connections, global shipping connections that arise out of Beirut. And I, one day, wouldn't mind doing a little bit of work on that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I do see one very straightforward question from an audience member, which is how can they get a copy of this book? And I believe through the Verso publisher's website, it's available. And they've got, correct?
I think until the end of August, they've got some sort of a crazy sale going. So if you can get it through the Verso website.
Yes, so, VERSO, and I think it's some sort of pandemic discount. Yes, since everyone's stuck at home and reading, there's like a 15% discount on the website for the book.
There's also a question about Mark Levinson's The Box, which actually was also one of the early books. It is another one that was truly inspiring, and one of the interesting things is that the box, the shipping container, has led to essentially the lower cost of labor and of course, lower cost of transport. And in fact, one of the things that started me on my project was the chapter, I can even tell you the chapter 8 of Mark Levinson's book, which was about how the shipping container became a standard form of shipping when the US was fighting in Vietnam, and it wanted efficient, palletized, and non-pilfered goods to be shipped from the Pacific to Vietnam. And they were put into shipping containers that were shipped to Vietnam. And the shipping companies, these were commercial shipping companies that were chartered by the US government, on their way back, they didn't want to come back empty. So they would go to Japan. And this was in the 1960s. And they were loading, 60s and 70s, and they were loading the electronics from Japan's nascent electronics industry and shipping them back to the Pacific, which of course was the start of the rise of Japan as the one during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the greatest maker of electronic goods and the greatest exporter of electronic goods, certainly in the US. And so the shipping container had this kind of a pivotal role connecting the Vietnam War to Japanese trade. And that was what I sort of wanted to get at, was that these things are so imbricated into one another. They're so interwoven, and it's so difficult to prize them apart. War and trade are truly the two sides of the same coin, really.
I'm very glad you actually mentioned that, Laleh, because this is something that students, and I teach a Middle East political economy class, they're always very interested in sort of why the Middle East is not an export-oriented economy, or why they don't export a lot of materials. And I also always point back to this period where there was an enormous amount of US support and subsidization of exports from East Asia, some of which came about because of the containerization and the fact that there was this easy way to get goods that were produced in East Asia back to the US and to European markets. And so there was really no room for US or for Middle East exports of manufactured goods, because it was the market was already saturated by that point with goods from East Asia arising out of the Vietnam War, which is of course blows a lot of students' minds, because most of them have very little sort of background on the Vietnam War at all. I don't see, and
I can actually say something
yes.
to that.
Oh,
that also goes back to what Pascal mentioned about the free zones. So the work on free zones that I started was also inspired by a guy, an anthropologist, that is working on a really interesting project on the history of free zones. He's going through archives of the consulting firms that were really interested in establishing these. His name is Patrick Neveling. And the amazing thing that he shows is that the free zones were actually not only for the dictators to ensure that they could suspend all laws, all regulation, all oversight, in order to ensure that some degree of production was happening in these free zones. But also, it was intended as a kind of a Cold War weapon, geopolitical weapon. The US really encouraged free zones, because in the free zones there would be no unions, production would shift in there, et cetera, But one of the interesting things that it's as far back as whenever it was that Fred Halliday wrote his Arabia Without Sultans, he mentions the fact that having free zones in Yemen was absolutely detrimental to the encouragement of any form of productive industry within Yemen itself, because having these free zones meant that essentially you had goods that came in and goods that were shipped out. You became a kind of a transit hub, and that in a way made it provided no incentives whatsoever for any kind of production to happen. And so the fact that free zones have proliferated so extensively throughout the Middle East, and weirdly actually they started off proliferating, this was the thing that blew my mind, was that, for example, Yemen, or PDRY, so the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the South Yemen, the Marxist Yemen, was the first place to have a free zone. I mean, that, well, other than the colonial free zones, but I mean, that is pretty astonishing. And so that to me was also mind-blowing, is the way that these modular forms in which capitalism reproduces itself are taken and even absorbed by places like PDRY.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We do have a question here from Helen Jang. She says, thank you so much for an insightful discussion. Could you comment on regional choke points, such as the Straits of Malacca or Hormuz, and energy security in terms of political economy? For example, China built the overland Shui pipelines via Myanmar to circumvent regional conflict. How do choke points facilitate and disrupt regional political economy? And she is she's a program coordinator at GW at the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. Thank you very much, Helen.
That's a really great question. I mean, so there are two different ways in which I can answer this question. One is that on the one hand, the production of these spaces as being choke points, as being places that are narrow, places that there are geographic issues with passage or political issues with passage, becomes often an alibi for external intervention. So I think it's really important to recognize that sometimes the fact that a place is called a kind of a dangerous choke point, whether that's Bab al-Mandab or Hormuz Straits or Malacca Straits, there often is an element of hyperbole about the intense dangers there. Having said that, there are also maritime reasons why such places are quite interesting zones, if you will, of security clashes. These kinds of narrower places are very good, for example, for piracy. These narrower places are also extremely excellent for military or naval surveillance. One of the most fascinating things that happens is that I was aboard 2 container ships as part of the research for this. So I went twice from Malta to Jabal Ali, through Suez, Bab al-Mandab, around the peninsula, and then through the Strait of Hormuz to Jabal Ali. And the most fascinating moments of being on the sea itself, the most fascinating moments were arriving in the ports and leaving them. That was just fantastic. In particular, because I was not able to get a visa for Saudi Arabia, but I came into Jeddah by sea, which was pretty fantastic. So that was fabulous. But aside from that, what was really interesting was that when you got to someplace like Bab al-Mandab, Bab al-Mandab is only 13 miles across. So on the one side is Yemen, on the other side is Djibouti. And what you actually notice is the extent to which there are various kinds of states or transnational security forces that circulate around those areas. Piracy is often used as the excuse for that, or in Hormuz, intervention by the Iranian security forces. But it actually provides a really good space for lots of different navies to come through. And it's fascinating to see that, I mean, every time that I went through, there was some sort of an aircraft carrier, whether it was US or French, was going to Charles de Gaulle aircraft, and then there were EU NAV force, naval force, helicopters and warships were there, Chinese warships. The Dutch were all over Bab al-Mandab, which I found really fascinating. And so these were zones of security in that sense. And to me, a lot of that was, again, manufactured. It provided a template or an excuse for external intervention. In terms of how it means politically, economically, the difficulty of the difficulty of passage through the Strait of Hormuz was cited by Saudi Arabia as a reason for building a trans-Saudi pipeline from Jabal to Yambo in order for oil that was being brought out of the earth by Jabal on the Gulf to be shipped in a pipeline across to Yambo, which is halfway up the coast to Suez Canal, to go to Europe. Now, one of the fascinating things is that the Saudis are now, both through war and through negotiation, are trying to build a pipeline to the Indian Ocean, because now their primary client has shifted from being Europe to being in East Asia. And so an Indian Ocean port, which bypasses Hormuz, is something that they've been trying to negotiate with the Omanis. So Duqm, which is a new port in Oman, is potentially going to have a pipeline to Saudi Arabia. And of course, a port in Mahra, in the province of Mahra, in Yemen has been taken over by Saudi, and it's now there's a lot of pushback by the Mahri people against Saudi occupation, but they wanted to turn the port of it's called Qaida into a shipping port. So that to me is also something where trade and security end up overlapping, and in fact the epilogue of the book is about the port of Al-Qaeda and what might happen should the Saudis succeed in building that pipeline and a shipping port there. There's a question here from Nada Al-Kuni about whether I started with the stories or did I start with the archives, and how the connections were made, and were some of the discoveries along the way that most fascinated you about these connections, because the book is essentially about these sinews. I've always been interested in connections far more than I am about the objects. I have an undergraduate degree in engineering, and I'm a kind of a math nerd, and so I always do see connections and patterns between things, and I think that always helped. But I actually didn't even start with stories about the Gulf. I started with novels, and it is fascinating that there are a set of novels that the maritime genre is one of the biggest genres of writing literature. And it is fascinating because the more you read them, the more you realize the aspects that often are not covered or academics are often not interested in, because somehow it falls out, somehow it's not quite explicable by the usual methodologies that we social scientists use. Historians are much better at that. And so in part, I started with those kinds of thematics, which I thought were really interesting and appeared through these through the novels, and then started looking for those elements in books, and then from there went on to the archives. But it was an iterative process. So certain archives I went back to again and again and again, British Petroleum Archive being one of them, because you found stuff, you went and worked it, you came back, you wanted more stuff. And in fact, I'm going to go back to those archives hopefully when they're open post-COVID in order to do a bit more research with the tankers. Now, Yusra,
you see from Yusra? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yusra Hussain says, could you expand on the symbiotic relationship you mentioned between ports and roads? That's a really great question. Ports and roads and ports and rail, and actually in Europe, also ports and rivers. In order for you, so in very, very big ports like Jabal Ali is, or Singapore is, or Shanghai is, Shanghai is actually primarily an export port. I mean, most of the good that comes in is raw material, but most of the stuff is exported. But Singapore and Jabal Ali are two of the biggest transit ports in the world, which means that goods come in and they are redistributed out of there. Often they're put on smaller ships, which are called feeders, and these smaller ships then go along the coast. So Kuwait, for example, has no port that has as deep a draft, as depth, has a depth that can handle the largest container ships. And so a lot of the goods that come in to Jabal Ali end up being put on smaller feeder ships and go up to the Gulf to just regular container ships, but smaller ones, and they go up to Kuwait. Of course, as I said, a lot of the goods that comes off then goes into the market and also is fed through, whether through licit or illicit smuggling or otherwise, especially because of the sanctions, to Iran, Pakistan, and East Africa on those. And there are, of course, feeder ships also across the way to Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan, India. What's also interesting is that until the blockade of Qatar by UAE and Saudi started, Jabal Ali in Dubai was the port of transit for Qatar. And as soon as the blockade happened, they switched their port of transit to Sohar in Oman. Well, actually Sohar and Salalah in Oman. So there's the ships that act as feeders, but also very importantly, you have the hinterland trade, which brings good in, but also takes goods out from the port and distributes it. And roads and rail have been the form that in most places they take roads primarily in the Arabian Peninsula. One of the things, and Pascal could probably talk about this a little bit more, but one of the things that was really fascinating to me was I actually went there and did just a quick sort of statistical study of seeing how, not descriptive statistics, of seeing how many miles of roads, how many kilometers of roads had been constructed, say, from the 1930s all the way through the contemporary time. And it was fascinating to see that UAE, for example, had something like 60 miles of roads, but by the time it went independent in 1970, because the British weren't interested in building roads. And the same was actually also true of Saudi Arabia, where there were roads connecting, for example, Jeddah to Mecca and Medina, and roads over by the Gulf Coast connecting the cities in which, towns in which people lived to the ports, but and some other connections, but really not that many roads. And then you see that after the various states got control over their own economies, you had much more significant projects of road building. Now, some of these were, of course, as Pascal shows us in his book, is all about the building of suburbia. It's about forms of sort of economic production in which the ruling family are tied into the capitalists. There's a kind of an exchange happening. A lot of these roads are roads to nowhere. They are. But in the case of the ports, they do actually emanate from the port and they go to various cities elsewhere. There's also been some plans on building rails, and of course the most significant of these is the railway that goes from Gulf Coast of Saudi Arabia to Riyadh. But ever since the 1950s, the Saudis were trying to get Aramco and then later anybody who would help them to extend the road from Riyadh to Jeddah. And of course, there was very little interest on the part of Aramco or the US or the British or anybody to do that because, of course, it didn't fit their own particular national interests, economic interests. So I think that there's quite a bit that I've written in there about that. There's also a wonderful PhD thesis by Matthew McLean, and I think an article, I don't know whether or not he's published it, but I think it's available online, about the roads in the UAE and the way that they get caught up in geopolitics between Nasser and Saudi Arabia and others before their independence, which I really highly recommend, as well as Joyriding in Riyadh, which is probably one of the best books ever anybody could have written, gripping about roads. Okay.
Yes, I was going to say, you can tell you're such a professional at doing these book tours because you stopped firmly at 1 o'clock. Should we close now? I know we said 1 hour because people get exhausted on Zoom. And we don't want to impinge on Laleh or Pascal's time. So I wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us. We do have another event in this series, September 24th, with Gokja Punel, discussing her book, Spaceship Abu Dhabi, with Dean Sharp as discussant, and that's on September 24th. Yes, you can visit our website. It will also be a virtual event. So we hope to see many of you there, and wanted to thank you both so much for this. It was really, really wonderful. We've been interested in this book for so long, and we've been trying to get Laleh here to GW for so long. So it's wonderful that we could do it now.
Thank you.
Virtually.
Thank you very much for having me. And if anybody has actually questions that they would like to ask, you're welcome to find my email address should be available on the Queen Mary website. So please do feel free to shoot me an email. And thank you so much, Pascal, Shana, Mona, and Christian, who's the silent organizer behind all of this, for arranging all of this. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Goodbye,
so
everyone.
much.